Well, hello again, and welcome back to Sunday Arvo Sermons with Pastor E. Or if you're joining us for the first time, we just want you to know you are so welcome, and we are thrilled to have you with us. We're looking at a series on the Gospel of Mark, and I've titled the series, Even the Wind and the Waves Obey Him. And this week we're moving into chapter 8 and 9 of the Gospel of Mark. And the title of today's sermon is Jesus Awaits Your Reply. The promise of the scriptures for all followers of Jesus is that when we die, we will immediately enter into the presence of Jesus, where we will see him face to face. Wow! There is just nothing to compare to that thought. I wonder if I will ever want to look at anything or anyone else from that moment onwards. If I eventually turn my attention to anything else going on in heaven, there are some Bible characters that I will relish the opportunity to meet. And some questions I would like to ask them are as follows. First of all, Noah. Noah, could you please tell me, how did you build that ark? Moses, could you please talk me through the parting of the Red Sea? David, could you please describe for me how you took Goliath down? Elijah, could you please share with me a blow-by-blow description of that showdown on Mount Carmel? Mary and Joseph, could you please tell me your favourite parenting stories of raising Jesus? The Apostle Paul, could you please unpack the book of Romans for me? And the Apostle John, could you please unpack the book of Revelation for me? I tell you what, I will be jumping out of my skin as a history buff, as well as to meet these great heroes of the faith. In the passage we are looking at today, Peter, James, and John had what I believe must have been the most incredible experience possible this side of eternity, when Jesus took them on an adventure on a mountaintop that Peter appears to have recounted to Mark, who has recorded it for posterity in his gospel. More on that unforgettable moment soon, but first we turn our attention to what is the turning point in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. So far, Jesus has been introducing his disciples to his ministry as a kind of general overview. However, as we arrive at this point in chapter 8, we can see that Jesus changes gears, and his focus on his ultimate mission begins to sharpen dramatically. And it is also at this point that he starts to challenge his disciples about the suffering that is ahead for him, and as a result for them, and consequently for all of us who are followers of Jesus. So there's 8 aspects of this passage about what Jesus is doing here, and it impacts on us directly as followers of Jesus. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, then I hope this really challenges you about the value of this momentous decision that I am praying that you'll make one day, if not today. Mark chapter 8, we come in at verse 27, and the action is being described. Jesus and his disciples went to the villages near the town of Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "What do people say about me?" The disciples answered, "Some say you are John the Baptist, or maybe Elijah. Others say you are one of the prophets." Now that's understandable. Apparently, Herod and his wife, who had been responsible for the beheading of John the Baptist, heard about what Jesus had been accomplishing, and they had this terrible fear that this was John the Baptist come back to life. And obviously Elijah is a great hero of the Hebrew people, and miracles were part of his territory, and it was obvious that Jesus had that same impact. Others say you are one of the prophets. Of course, Moses comes to mind, and Jesus had made it clear that he was making that claim to be from the same God of Moses. But then Jesus asked them, "But who do you say I am?" "You are the Messiah," Peter replied. Now, this is a big moment. It's obvious that this is who Jesus is, and Peter has got that he is the Messiah. But up till then, Jesus had not at all tackled this issue of, well, what does this Messiah bring to the table? Who is this Messiah really? Up till then, the disciples had very much an understanding that the Messiah would be a military and political saviour for the Hebrew people. And it is at this moment now that Peter has got it, and Peter, this leader of the disciples, has got it. The others, no doubt, value what Peter thinks. And Jesus, at this point, identifies that this is the moment where he now unpacks to his disciples what that really means, what Messiah means. And, well, quite frankly, the disciples are in for a shock. So number 2, Jesus has warnings for us. Verse 30, immediately after Peter said, "You are the Messiah," Jesus warned the disciples not to tell anyone about him. So he's still doing this thing, isn't he, the Lord Jesus, where people recognise that there's something remarkable about him. And now Peter has not just gone for remarkable, he has identified that he's Messiah. And Jesus says, don't tell anyone about me. And we have to wonder why. Well, the reason is because of Jesus' mission. And he will allow nothing to derail his mission, as we shall see in just a moment. Number 3, Jesus has hard lessons to teach us. As a follower of Jesus for over 30 years now, I can vouch for that. I've had many hard lessons to learn, and I would not be surprised if there's more ahead for me. Verse 31, Jesus began telling his disciples, and that key word there is began. This is the moment where Jesus began to teach the disciples the next level of what it meant to be a follower of the Messiah. Jesus began telling them what would happen to him. He said, the nation's leaders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law of Moses will make the Son of Man suffer terribly. He will be rejected and killed, but 3 days later he will rise to life. Now, any follower of Jesus today knows that that is exactly what happened. But let's give the disciples a bit of slack. Let's cut them some slack here. They did not know what was ahead. So often with biblical prophecy, we look back on prophecies that have been fulfilled and we say, well, yeah, that's what the Bible said would happen. That's what the prophet said would happen. That's what Jesus said would happen, and it happened. However, there are many prophecies in the scriptures that have not yet been fulfilled. And say you get a group of 100 believers together, you could get 100 different opinions on how that will play out. I mentioned the book of Revelation, and just my great dream that I look forward to of sitting there with John and the Apostle John just unpacks everything about it. But right now there's all sorts of theories ranging from sensible to the most wacky, weird and wonderful on the book of Revelation. So we will not know what exactly the details of these prophecies will look like until they're played out, until they happen. And then we'll say, well, yeah, there it is. It's exactly as the Bible said would happen. So Jesus told them right there in verse 31, this is what's going to happen. And yet this was just too much for them to take in. They could not comprehend of this terrible suffering that was ahead for the Messiah, who up to this point, remember, they saw him as basically their equivalent of Captain America. I know that falls far short of who the Messiah is, but I just want to paint a picture of what the disciples were looking for in their Messiah. R.C. Sproul observes this. He says, writing in the years after Jesus' earthly ministry, when the cross and the resurrection were accomplished facts, The New Testament authors pointed their contemporaries to all the Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah. They directed attention to Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 52 to 53, which shows that the Ebed Yahweh, the servant of the Lord, would bear the sins of the people, would be despised, would be rejected by men, and would be smitten by God himself, afflicted and killed. They focused on Psalm 22, which reads like an eyewitness account of the crucifixion. But in the centuries before Jesus came, the rabbis completely missed what the text was saying. They did not conceive of applying Isaiah 52 to 53, Psalm 22, or other prophecies to the Messiah. They thought these texts applied to the nation of Israel as it passed through affliction and suffering. Therefore, when Jesus began to use these Old Testament prophecies to teach his disciples what it meant for him to be the Messiah, they were shocked. They had never heard such ideas before. Furthermore, they understood that if the Messiah had to suffer, be rejected and die, that probably meant suffering, rejection and death for the Messiah's disciples. They received these words of Jesus not only as a death sentence on him, but a death sentence on themselves. And that was the last thing they wanted to hear. And that brings us to number 4. Jesus tells us the plain and honest truth. Verse 32, then Jesus explained clearly what he meant. There was no mystery. I understand that God does move in mysterious ways. His ways are higher than our ways. But in this moment, this was Jesus speaking crystal clear about what was happening. So as he explained further and clearly what he meant, Peter took Jesus aside and told him to stop talking like that. But when Jesus turned and saw the disciples, he corrected Peter. He said to him, Satan, get away from me. You are thinking like everyone else and not like God. Wow. This is a real roller coaster, isn't it? For Peter especially. So this brings us to number 5. Jesus brings correction to our lives. And R.C. Sproul continues with his wonderful insight on this. He says, Jesus showed Peter that there are basically 2 ways of looking at things, God's way and man's way. This is the great divide between godliness and godlessness. The godly person is deeply concerned about the things of God, but the godless person has no concern for the things of God. Instead, he is preoccupied with this world. We all need to evaluate ourselves on these criteria from time to time. We need to ask ourselves, where is my heart? What is my chief concern? Am I preoccupied with the things of this world, or does my heart beat for the things of God? Am I seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness and letting everything else come as it will? Or is there some other priority that drives me, some ambition that compels me, some goal to which all of my energy is devoted in this world? Good questions to ask, aren't they? And so we come to number 6. Jesus has an invitation for us. Verse 34, Jesus then told the crowd and the disciples to come closer, and he said, if any of you want to be my followers, did you hear that? Any of you. No one is excluded from this invitation. If any of you want to be my followers, you must forget about yourself. You must take up your cross and follow me. But do you hear that he is exclusive there? You must take up your cross and follow me. It's Jesus alone who has the way to salvation. Verse 35, if you want to save your life, you will destroy it. But if you give up your life for me and for the good news, you will save it. What will you gain if you own the whole world but destroy yourself? What could you give to get back your soul? Don't be ashamed of me and my message among these unfaithful and sinful people. If you are, the Son of Man will be ashamed of you when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And moving ahead into chapter 9, from verse 1, Mark writes, I can assure you, and this is a very significant quote that he records Jesus as saying, and it's one that has been a controversial one about how to interpret it. But again, I believe if you look at the context, Jesus is teaching very clearly, very plainly, very straightforward. So that context should not suddenly change with this statement, should it? I don't think so. Verse 1, I can assure you that some of the people standing here will not die before they see God's kingdom come with power. So we're about to find out what he meant by that. Number 7, Jesus has adventures for us. You know, we're talking here about the suffering of life as a follower of Jesus. But one thing that I guarantee you will never experience as a follower of Jesus is boredom. You have been saved not only from the fires of hell and eternal damnation, you have been saved from boredom. And I don't mean to make light of it, but that is a guarantee. Jesus calls us on an adventure. This is the adventure of a lifetime. And he has adventures ahead for every follower. Verse 2, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James and John with him. They went up on a high mountain where they could be alone. There, in front of the disciples, Jesus was completely changed. And we'll get to that. A few years ago, my wife Sandy and I climbed Frenchman Peak down in Esperance. It's quite a well-known hill. I wouldn't call it a mountain, but it's a good climb. You need a good 2 hours for the return trip. And visible from the road as you drive past Frenchman Peak is a little gap up near the top. It just looks like a tiny little hole in the rock at the top of Frenchman Peak. But you get to the top of Frenchman Peak and you realise this is a huge cave, probably the size of a soccer pitch, and plenty of space there to stand and look out over the view, which is incredible. You can see the coastline of Esperance, almost a 360 view. Wonderful. Now, in this adventure that Mark's describing, Jesus took James, Peter and John up to a mountain. He doesn't designate which mountain, but it's generally agreed that it was either Mount Hermon or Mount Tabor, two significant mountains in Israel. If you're hearing some pitter-patter, that's our golden retriever, Sadie. She's just investigating what's happening here. So they climbed to the top of this mountain, and up the top of this mountain, something happened supernaturally to Jesus. He was transfigured, and Mark describes what Peter saw as an eyewitness. Verse 3, and his clothes became much whiter than any bleach on earth could make them. Then Moses and Elijah were there talking with Jesus. So can you imagine that? I shared in the introduction how one of the exciting expectations upon entering heaven is to be able to meet, of course, Jesus face to face, but in addition to that, people like Moses and Elijah. And there's Moses and Elijah there appearing side by side, standing beside Jesus, talking with him, most likely encouraging him about what's ahead and the suffering that is ahead, but the victory that will follow. And Peter, just completely bowled over by this. Verse 5, Mark continues the description of the action. Peter said to Jesus, "Teacher, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But I love this. I love the way Mark puts it. He says, but Peter and the others were terribly frightened, and he did not know what he was talking about. It's priceless, isn't it? Peter felt like he should say something, and it was not the cleverest thing to say. Verse 7, the shadow of a cloud passed over and covered them. From the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, and I love him. Listen to what he says." At once the disciples looked around, but they only saw Jesus. N.T. Wright, I love his perspective on this event. He says this: the three watchers and the others were of course terrified. Peter, we're getting to know him quite well now, blurts out the first thing that comes into his head, trying vaguely not only to prolong the moment, but to hook it into one of the Jewish festivals. That wasn't the point, but the sheer oddity of his bumbling suggestion is itself strong evidence of the story's basic truth. Nobody inventing a tale like this would make up such a comic moment, lowering the tone of the occasion in such a fashion. As Jesus and his disciples were coming down from the mountain, continues Mark in verse 9, he told them not to say a word about what they had seen. There it is again, this incredible event, but don't say a word. Jesus is making sure this mission is not derailed. Not to say a word about what they had seen until the Son of Man had been raised from death. So they kept it to themselves, but they wondered what he meant by the words raised from death. Remember, they're still coming to grips with this Messiah's mission. He's not the military and political hero. He is someone who has come to die for them. They haven't really comprehended it yet. Verse 11, the disciples asked Jesus, "Don't the teachers of the law of Moses say that Elijah must come before the Messiah does?" Jesus answered, "Elijah certainly will come to get everything ready. But don't the scriptures also say that the Son of Man must suffer terribly and be rejected? I can assure you that Elijah has already come, and people treated him just as they wanted to, as the scriptures say they would." Jesus is Lord. And what Peter, James and John saw on that mountaintop, the Transfiguration, showed that Jesus came from another place. This was a supernatural event, confirming that he is the Messiah. But still, the disciples have a ways to go to really get a grasp of this. And Jesus there assured them that John the Baptist had come in the spirit of Elijah. Remember, John came preparing the way, announcing the coming of the Messiah. So I simply have a question for you to close with. Jesus is awaiting your answer to his question. Who do you say he is? What's your reply? I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to make comments below. I will reply to any comments you make. Thanks for listening. God bless.